Game 7 of the World Series, the NBA Finals. A culmination of a long season in which competitors attempt to outduel each other for supremacy. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas faced a similar verbal duel in the fall of 1898, attempting to become the next senator from the great state of Illinois. The purpose of their debates was to rouse support for their individual candidates, state legislators, who in turn would select the U.S. Senator to Washington, D.C. Remember, this is before the 17th Amendment and the direct election of senators. Their debates, of course, centered on many issues: slavery, its expansion, the role of popular sovereignty, the intent of the founders, what did the Declaration and Constitution mean, and the role of a new political party. Indeed, these were weighty issues that they deliberated. Lincoln began by questioning the audience if this agitation over slavery sprung, in his words, from the mere ambition of politicians. No, he says, the agitation, the tumult, was almost exclusively caused by past endeavors to spread this institution, to spread slavery. Lincoln is not deflecting the root of the issue from politicians such as himself, a man-made problem. Rather, he begins by focusing on the moral act of spreading slavery. What does it mean? What's the moral implication of having slaves and then taking them from one place to another? This is an active and a concrete process in which a master physically moves his property, in the words of the Supreme Court, to another territory, in this case, a free territory. Now, will this allow slavery to spread? Is it right to do that? Is it not? That's the main thing that Lincoln and Douglas are debating. It's interesting. Lincoln's statements about the spread of slavery kind of harken back to the famous literary movement of another slave, that of Eliza in Uncle Tom's Cabin, crossing the Ohio River. Lincoln further stresses the point with the mention that this peculiar institution has indeed been so divisive in the past that some of America's great Protestant churches have fractured over the issue of slavery. The Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Unitarian Church, all of them have found themselves splitting over whether or not you can have slaves and whether or not you can take them as you please. Are they property? Are they people? Are they something else? As Lincoln continues, he points out Douglas's oft-repeated refrain over the expansion issue. Douglas, as Lincoln paraphrases, says, "We are to quit talking about it. Are we to care nothing about it?" Earlier in that debate, Douglas had said that he looks forward to a time when each state shall be allowed to do as it pleases. If it chooses to keep slavery forever, it is not my business, but its own. If it chooses to abolish slavery, it's its own business, not mine. He goes on to say he cares more about the great principle of self-government than all the N-words in Christendom. Indeed, Douglas is portraying this attitude of the fact that he doesn't care. So why would Lincoln even point out Douglas's supposed lack of concern over the issue? What can Lincoln gain through this? Lincoln later states in the debate, "Is it not a false sense of philosophy? Indeed, it is the very thing that everybody cares the most about." By taking this approach, Lincoln is painting Douglas as a plain and simple politician in our modern day worst definition. He's portraying Douglas as somebody who will say and do anything, including popular sovereignty, moving into the territories, as a way to hold on to his incumbent Senate seat in Illinois. In this case, Douglas professes no personal opinion on the most divisive issue of their time, and likely the most divisive issue of American history ever. Think about it. What more could people debate and worry about than whether or not you can own another person, whether a person is human chattel to be bought, sold, and moved like a cart, a pig, a shirt. Surely everyone had an opinion over the issue of slavery, whether they were for it or against it. The fact that people, rational, thinking, caring, concerned people would be ambivalent struck Lincoln as impossible. Douglas, of course, has a policy in which his lack of care is rooted: popular sovereignty. The belief that each territory, and soon to be state, would decide through elections if slavery would be permitted or prohibited. As we saw in the case of Kansas, this wasn't a simple exercise in democratic government with voters turning out to the polls, speaking their minds, and tacitly abiding by the results. No, Kansas was known as Bleeding Kansas for a specific reason. Instead, popular sovereignty hinges on a more basic question. In this case, should a majority be able to vote and subject the minority to specific rules? So, would the white male voters in a territory forever be able to decide the future of black men, women, and children? Lincoln says no, that this is not fair. This is not what the founders intended. This is not how a democratic or a republican form of government should work. Of course, he refutes Douglas's assumption that popular sovereignty is somehow the way to go. He says that in moral issues, it doesn't matter what the majority thinks, that what's right is right. Although we can never know the answer, it's often fun to play historical what-ifs. What would Lincoln think about? What would he do if he was here today? For example, what would Lincoln think of recent and modern cases where you have the majority deciding what happens to a minority group? What about state versus federal laws? If only it were possible to learn Lincoln's thoughts on things such as Jim Crow segregation of the late 1800s and early 20th century, or Lincoln's thoughts on school segregation that was ultimately resolved with the Brown versus the Board of Education case in the 1950s. What would Lincoln say about gay marriage? Can the majority voters of one state decide what happens to a minority group in that state? And in the case of federal versus state laws, what are some other issues that come up today? It's a frequent refrain. We hear it all the time. What would Lincoln say about states legalizing the use of marijuana? What would Lincoln say about federal statutes such as EPA requirements that some states do not want to abide by? We really can't know. And as we have seen just through Lincoln's political career, his views were continually evolving. Now, the real issue, according to Lincoln, is the distinction between the two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. One party, the Republicans, see slavery as wrong, while the other does not. Plain and simple. One party wants slavery, one party doesn't. Lincoln draws a fine line, and he's going to hammer home that point throughout the rest of the debate. Lincoln next launches into an assault against slavery in some of the most eloquent language in describing slavery as a moral wrong. Indeed, in Lincoln's own words, he will combat it as having an evil tendency and design. One implication of Chief Justice Roger Taney's Dred Scott decision and subsequent Douglas speeches was the implication that Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers did not include blacks when they wrote that all men were created equal. Lincoln finds this offensive and launches into assault upon both men, saying, "There has never been a man, so far as I know or believed, in the whole world, who has said that the Declaration of Independence did not include Negroes in the term all men." Lincoln says that while many men have denied the truth of it, Taney and Douglas are the first men who have actually specifically said those words and spoken them out loud. He is putting the weight on these two men as the first ones to say that blacks are not included in the Declaration of Independence. Think about the weight of that for a minute. Douglas counters with this assertion that when Jefferson wrote the Declaration and said all men, that he was referring to the colonists who were British subjects and that they were, of course, entitled to the rights of British citizens. Now, Lincoln says that this really makes no sense, that Jefferson is submitting facts to a candid world. He's not telling England only why they should be free. He's telling the entire world, men of the world, why they should be free. Whether it's men in Finland, in Fiji, in the Far East, all men. And according to Lincoln's argument, all men indeed means all men. He continues with some statements about slavery that might be somewhat conflicting. He states, it's interesting, that slavery will continue when the poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. Does he mean when the debate's over, when the election's over, when Douglas and Lincoln are both deceased? When will their tongues be silent? But he says that the debate over slavery will continue for some time. Interestingly, though, later in the debate, he says that the issue, quote, will be soon settled, and peaceably too. So he's saying one thing and saying something very different in the same speech. What does Lincoln mean by that? Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he's hopeful that the issue will soon be settled. As we all know, of course, it will not soon be settled, at least not until much bloodshed during the Civil War. Resuming his impassioned discussion over the immorality of slavery, Lincoln refers to it as an eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. Think about it. What other issues are more clear-cut than slavery, than right and wrong? Perhaps Hitler in World War II? What else is so clear? Going back and relating the issue to the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln compares slavery as pitting the right of humanity against the divine right of kings. Lincoln uses this phrase frequently, but he says that people will be forced to choose. And he makes this comparison in 1858, actually in 1854 in Peoria. He continues it up into the Civil War. He sees slavery as the most basic argument. The right of one man to work for himself and to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Slavery takes the unfair, the tyrannical, the un-American approach in which one man tells another, quote, "You work and toil and earn the bread, and I'll eat it." To Lincoln and to many others, it makes no difference if the one doing the taking and the eating of the bread is a despot, is a monarch, is a tyrannical ruler such as King George III, or if it's a slave owner. The effect is the same, and this old serpent, in Lincoln's words, should be put on its course toward ultimate extinction. As we know, despite this impassioned plea and argument against slavery, Lincoln will not win the 1858 election to the U.S. Senate from Illinois. He later remarked to a friend that it hurts too much to laugh, but I'm too old to cry. Later, he would remark to a friend that he will now sink out of view and shall be forgotten. I believe I have made some marks which will tell for the cause of civil liberty long after I am gone. It's difficult to ascertain whether this is Lincoln just being in his famous melancholic moods following the defeat, if it's his self-deprecating tendencies that he's applying, or if they're the words of a knowledgeable politician. Perhaps he's soliciting praise from his friends. Before he ran for president in 1860, he told one of his friends, and this is another famous quote of his, "The fight must go on. The cause of liberty must not be surrendered at the end of 1 or even 100 defeats." Lincoln would go on, and he would find an immeasurable will to preserve the Union and to do something no politician had ever done before: render slavery extinct.